Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for joining us today for a sutta study. So today we have Bhante Suddhāso, who will be sharing with us a sutta from the Anguttara Nikaya. So if you'd like to follow along during the talk, you can click the link in the live chat to Bhante Suddhāso's translation. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them in. So good morning so far to Liz, Gita Nyana, as well as Cows, our friend, who says good afternoon. So I'm assuming you're in Europe or somewhere along there. Africa, Europe, Middle East. So, and good morning to Michael and Warrior Anj. So thanks everyone, as well as to our viewers who are watching but not typing in. And hello, Ishan. So at this time, I'll pass things over to Bhante for this morning's sutta discussion.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namasami. Hello, friends, and welcome to another sutta study. So today we'll be looking at Anguttara Nikaya 5.26, the Vimuttayatana Sutta, which is translated here as circumstances of liberation. So this word vimutti means liberation, freedom, and is usually used in the suttas to mean enlightenment. The attainment of freedom from suffering, freedom from delusion, which is the goal of Buddhist practice. And the word ayatana, most commonly the word ayatana is used either to refer to the 6 sense domains, or it's used to refer to particular states of mind which are beyond physicality. So it's a little bit unusual that here it's used in a more general sense to mean the circumstances or conditions under which one attains liberation. So the word ayatana literally means extending or reaching or spreading. So it's the domain or extent of something. So another translation could, instead of circumstances of liberation, another translation could be domains of liberation, areas of liberation, or possibly even extent of liberation. But on this occasion, I had chosen to translate it as circumstances because, as you'll see when we get into the sutta, that's more how the Buddha is using the word in this context. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and periodically I'll stop and give some explanations. Then at the end of the explanations, then we can have some Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to type them in at any time and I'll answer them at the end. So the sutta begins. This is presumably the Buddha speaking. Monks, there are 5 circumstances of liberation where a monk who is vigilant, ardent, and self-directed liberates his unliberated mind, eliminates his unlimited corruptions, and attains the unattained supreme safety. What 5? So this is just introducing the topic. So 5 circumstances of liberation. And then he speaks about 3 qualities to bring to one's practice. So he says a monk who is vigilant. So the Pali word is appamatta, which is another form of the more commonly known word appamada. So appamada can be translated as vigilance or diligence, heedfulness, non-negligence. And these are all adequate translations. So it indicates a mind which is paying full attention to one's experience, but which also is very careful to avoid any harmful activities of body, speech, and mind. So to avoid engaging in any defilements of mind, and which is making an effort to cultivate and develop wholesome states of mind. So this quality of vigilance or heedfulness or diligence in one's practice is not just talking about bare awareness, but it's talking about an active effort to recognize the arising of unwholesome phenomena and to cut them off immediately. As well as the effort to recognize opportunities for wholesomeness and to seize those opportunities, to cultivate the wholesome when the opportunity arises. So this quality of appamada, so vigilance or heedfulness, combines elements of both mindfulness and right effort. So it's important to recognize the quality of this word. There's a number of suttas where the Buddha speaks about the critical importance of appamada, heedfulness or vigilance. And in fact, traditionally it's said that the final words of the Buddha were appamadena sampadehi, which means practice with vigilance, practice with diligence, with heedfulness. The second word that's mentioned here is ardent. So in Pali, that's atapi, which is from the word tapas, which means heat or energy or fervor. So this is indicating the fervent energy to bring to our practice. So not this kind of lackadaisical, spacey, daydreamy kind of attitude, but rather this fervent ardency, this sense that we're really deeply, thoroughly committed to doing the best we can. And the third quality he mentions here is self-directed. So in Pali, that's pahitatta, which is a compound of the words pahita. Pahita means directed, and atta, which means self. So that can either mean self-directed or directed towards oneself. So on this occasion, I chose to translate it as self-directed, so emphasizing that we're responsible for our own practice. We're responsible for directing our own mind, for directing our own efforts. We can't rely on any other. We can only rely upon our own self-motivation, our own self-direction. But the other way of translating this word pahitatta, so directed towards oneself, is also indicating the inward focus. So we are first and foremost focused on fixing ourselves, fixing our own mind, fixing the flaws and defects within our own character, working on cultivating a mind of awakening within ourselves. So our practice is necessarily directed towards ourselves. It's necessarily directed towards cultivating goodness within ourselves. And then the Buddha speaks about three benefits that come when one practices correctly under the 5 circumstances that he's about to describe. First, he says, one liberates one's unliberated mind. So again, we have this word vimutta. So one liberates an unliberated mind. So avamuttang chittang vimucchati. So we're liberating the mind from greed, hatred, and delusion. We're liberating the mind from suffering. We're liberating the mind from discontent. We're liberating the mind from restriction. And what this ultimately means is liberating the mind from self-identity, from this self-obsessiveness. Second, eliminates one's uneliminated corruptions. So that's talking about the complete removal of all of one's defilements, the complete removal of all of the defects and flaws of one's character that inhibit the manifestation of perfect wisdom and compassion. And attaining the unattained supreme safety. So this is another way the Buddha talks about enlightenment, is he talks about attaining enlightenment as reaching the supreme safety. He talks about nibbana as the ultimate refuge, the ultimate security. So until we attain full enlightenment, we're never safe, because we're always being preyed upon by our own self-destructive habits of mind. We're always getting lost in samsara because we're being pulled around by our own desires, our own craving, our own attachment, our own delusion. So one of the phrases the Buddha repeats over and over in the suttas is he talks about beings being fettered by craving and obstructed by ignorance. So this is the nature of our experience. We're like a blind person being pulled around on a chain, except that we're not actually blind. It's just that we have tied a blindfold over our own eyes, and it's not anybody else pulling on that chain. We put the chain there, and we're the ones who pull on it. So the ultimate safety is to purify one's mind of all defilement and delusion, because then there's nothing that can harm us. There's nothing that can break our happiness. There's nothing that can disturb our peace of mind. So then the Buddha speaks about the first of the 5 circumstances. He says, "Here, monks, a monk is taught Dhamma by the teacher or by a respected co-practitioner." So teacher here means the Buddha. So in the suttas, whenever you see the teacher, which will usually be capitalized in translation, but not always, then that's referring to the Buddha. So it says, "Here amongst a monk is taught Dhamma by the teacher or by a respected co-practitioner." Monks, when that monk is being taught Dhamma by the teacher or by a respected co-practitioner, he experiences the meaning and the Dhamma. When one experiences the meaning and the Dhamma, joyfulness is born. When one is joyful, euphoria is born. When one has a euphoric mind, one's body becomes tranquil. When one has a tranquil body, one experiences happiness. When one is happy, one's mind enters samadhi. Monks, this is the first circumstance of liberation, where a monk who is vigilant, ardent, and self-directed liberates his unliberated mind, eliminates his uneliminated corruptions, and attains the unattained supreme safety. So this is the first circumstance. So first off, you'll notice here that this is not a case of somebody who's practicing meditation necessarily, but rather it's a case where somebody is listening to the Dhamma. So of course we don't have the Buddha here with us anymore, at least not in any visible form. But we still have other people who can teach the Dhamma, who can share the Dhamma. So experienced monks who can share the Dhamma with us. So when listening to the Dhamma, we make a conscious effort to experience the meaning of it, to experience the essence of the Dhamma, to experience what it's pointing towards. And so when we get a deep experience of the meaning of what's being spoken, a deep experience of the Dhamma, this underlying truth of the path that leads to awakening, then one becomes joyful. It's actually natural. It's like when you've been lost and suddenly you get a glimpse of the right way. Or you've been sick and then you start getting better. Somebody brings medicine to you. There's this sense of hopefulness of like, oh, there is an escape from this. I don't need to be lost in darkness and misery forever. There is an escape that's possible. So it's natural when we get a deep understanding of the Dhamma, it's natural that joyfulness arises because it starts to become clear to us that enlightenment is possible. It's attainable. It's not necessarily easy. In fact, it isn't easy, but it's achievable. It's doable. So this dukkha that we've been experiencing for as long as we can remember can come to an end. This confusion, which we've experienced for as long as we can remember, can be replaced by wisdom. How wonderful. So the mind becomes elated. And when one is joyful and elated, then one experiences euphoria. So this powerful, pleasant sensation all throughout body and mind. And when one has joy and euphoria, then one becomes peaceful, tranquil, not seeking anything. We can relax. And when all this comes together, so this joy and euphoria leading to tranquility of body, then one starts to experience a deep happiness of mind. So a serene happiness, a happiness which is not connected with limited sensual experiences, but a happiness which is connected with serenity, with equanimity, with letting go. And finally, in this sequence, the Buddha makes a very important statement. He says, when one is happy, one's mind enters samadhi. So in Pali, this is 3 words. Sukhino chittang samadhiyati. Sukhino means for one who is happy. Chittang, mind. Samadhiyati, attains samadhi. So samadhi is unification of mind, mental unification, mental stability, collectedness of mind. Samadhi is when the mind is stable and unwavering, when the mind is steady, unshakable. And samadhi most commonly is seen as the immediate prerequisite for the arising of wisdom. But there's also a few places in the suttas where the Buddha speaks about forms of samadhi which are directly productive of wisdom. Forms of samadhi which are in and of themselves a cultivation of insight. So the one which I most commonly speak about is called Animitta Samadhi, objectless concentration, which is itself a direct cultivation of wisdom, a direct cultivation of liberating insight through samadhi. Which seems to be what the Buddha is speaking about here as well, because he's talking about a circumstance where one attains liberation, the elimination of defilements, and the attainment of supreme safety. So he seems to be talking here not about a temporary experience of samadhi, so just like a little flash of temporary serenity, but rather he's talking about the kind of samadhi which leads to liberation. So once again, samadhi is steadiness of mind, collectedness of mind. So that steadiness of mind can be directed towards the renunciation of all phenomena, towards the relinquishment of all defilements, towards the abandoning of all self-identity. Because this is what leads to liberation. This is what leads to full enlightenment. So just emphasizing that this first circumstance is when one is hearing the Dhamma. One can attain enlightenment while listening to the Dhamma. So the next time you're hearing a Dhamma talk and you're like spacing out or nodding off or daydreaming or planning or thinking about other things, then you can remind yourself, no, this is a circumstance of liberation. This is a situation where enlightenment is possible if I pay attention, if I really try to understand the meaning of the Dhamma, and I really delight in the Dhamma, and I allow my mind to unify around that perception of Dhamma, then enlightenment is possible right here during this boring Dhamma talk. And then it will no longer be boring. In fact, it will become joyful. The second circumstance the Buddha mentions, he says, here monks, a monk is not taught the Dhamma by the teacher or a respected co-practitioner, but he teaches to others in detail the Dhamma that he has heard and mastered. Monks, when a monk teaches to others in detail the Dhamma that he has heard and mastered, he experiences the meaning and the Dhamma. When one experiences the meaning and the Dhamma, joyfulness is born. When one is joyful, euphoria is born. When one has a euphoric mind, one's body becomes tranquil. When one has a tranquil body, one experiences happiness. When one is happy, one's mind enters samadhi. Monks, this is the second circumstance of liberation. So this also is quite interesting. So in this case, one is teaching the Dhamma. So teaching the Dhamma in detail to others. So also the circumstance of teaching the Dhamma is something which can bring us to a deep contact with the meaning of the Buddha's teachings. It's something which can bring us to a deep realization of the Dhamma. And the mind can unify around that deep realization. The mind can stabilize in that direct perception of Dhamma, that direct knowingness of Dhamma. So this also means that we should not neglect the liberating value of sharing the Dhamma. So at this point, I've been teaching Dhamma for 8 years, I think. And something that's become incredibly clear to me over that time is how much my own understanding of Dhamma is deepened by teaching it to others. So I've met a number of practitioners over the years who have this attitude of, oh, I will never teach Dhamma. I will just do my own practice. But this is a misunderstanding, because sometimes our practice is to teach Dhamma to others. And sometimes it's in teaching Dhamma to others that we have some deep insight. And that deep insight is not necessarily a sudden flash, by the way. Sometimes it's a long, slow, gradual development. But sometimes it is a deep flash. I've had a number of times when I was teaching about a particular topic or a particular sutta, and I thought I already knew the topic pretty well, thought I was already quite familiar with it. The sutta I thought was pretty straightforward and clear. But then in the process of teaching and explaining it, some new depth of meaning opened up that I hadn't seen before. Some new vista, some broader understanding opened up through the course of teaching and explaining it to others. And also in the interaction with others, there can be a deeper understanding that can arise. So also conversation about Dhamma can be an incredibly valuable way of deepening one's understanding. And about challenging one's own misunderstandings. So it's important also to always come to the Dhamma with a humble mind, recognizing that clearly we're not quite getting it, because if we did, we would be enlightened by now. So there's always something more to learn, and it's possible that there's something that we've mislearned, and that needs to be adjusted. So the second circumstance is teaching the Dhamma. So this is another circumstance in which one can attain liberation. Then the third case, he says, here a monk is not taught Dhamma and does not teach to others the Dhamma, but he recites in detail the Dhamma that he has heard and mastered. Monks, when a monk recites in detail the Dhamma that he has heard and mastered, he experiences the meaning and the Dhamma. Joyfulness is born, euphoria is born, one's body becomes tranquil, one experiences happiness. When one is happy, one's mind enters samadhi. Monks, this is the third circumstance of liberation. So this, again, is a case where one is not listening to the Dhamma or teaching Dhamma, but one is reciting the Dhamma. So chanting. People often ask, what are the benefits of chanting? Well, here's a benefit. You can attain enlightenment. Does that sound like a good benefit? Interesting to anybody? Enlightenment, this whole enlightenment thing? I see some nods in the room. Yeah, so reciting the Dhamma. The Buddha says that reciting the Dhamma can be a circumstance of attaining enlightenment. So it's not something to set aside lightly. So I remember a number of times when it comes time for chanting. So in monasteries, normally we do chanting every day, often many times, several times a day. So coming to chanting, and I'm just like, oh God, here we go again. Oh my God, this is so awful. And what's happening there is that we're completely missing the opportunity that's available to us. We're completely missing an opportunity to cultivate the mind that inclines towards awakening. So reflecting on the meaning of what's being said, really taking to heart the meaning of what's being said. Or if you don't understand the words, well, learn what they mean. But in the meantime, use it as an opportunity to, first off, cultivate mindfulness of your own body, your own speech, mindfulness of the voices around you. One of the great things about chanting in a group is that you get to harmonize with other people, or try to harmonize with other people. And that requires a combination of attentiveness and renunciation, because we have to let go of the way we want to chant. Maybe you want to chant a little faster or a little slower. Well, you can't. You have to chant at the same speed as the rest of the group. Maybe you want to chant at a higher pitch or a lower pitch. Well, you can't. You have to try to match the pitch of everybody else. Maybe you don't want to chant in Pali. Maybe you want to chant in Chinese. Well, I'm with you, but sorry. If you're in a monastery where they're chanting Pali, then you chant Pali. Or maybe they're chanting in English and you don't want to chant in English. Well, too bad. That's just what's going on. So that quality of renunciation is looped in. And quality of attentiveness, of caring about others, is incorporated into chanting. And also it's an opportunity to cultivate energy, to put forth energetic effort into chanting. And it's also an opportunity to cultivate a mind of devotion to the Buddha, a sense of appreciation and affection and admiration for the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. And that sense of connection to a practice lineage stretching back to the Buddha himself. So people have been chanting these things for centuries, millennia. But optimally, again, as we're reciting the Dhamma, we are focusing on the meaning of what we're reciting. And as we focus on the meaning of it, then we get, once again, some deep realization of the Dhamma, some deep sense of what it's pointing to. And often this does happen even with something that we've chanted 100 times, 1,000 times, 10,000 times. Maybe it's something which we're deeply familiar with, but as we recite it, we start to get a more profound understanding of what it's talking about. We start to pierce through to a deeper layer. Or it settles in a way which hasn't happened before. So often we think, oh, well, I've chanted this 100 times. It's not going to be any different than the previous 100 times. But that's running off the false assumption that we're the same person that we were yesterday and the previous 100 days. But actually, we're a new person. We're a different person, a different set of memories and experiences and feelings and perceptions. So the experience that we're going to have is different from what we've had on previous times. So that means that maybe this time it will hit us in another spot, in a deeper way. So being open to the experience of reciting the Dhamma. I know one monk, a friend of mine who I've known for several years, who he always used to really hate chanting. And he always thought that chanting was just this silly ritual that we did because it's just part of the tradition, just one of those silly traditions that we do for no good reason. And he always hated going to the morning and evening chanting. And one day he was complaining to another monk about how much he hates the chanting and how stupid it, and how it's a waste of time and we should just do more meditation instead. And then the monk pulled out this sutta and it was like, oh, chanting can be a circumstance of liberation. Huh. And that completely turned around this monk's perception of chanting. And from that day forward, he came to really appreciate chanting the Dhamma, reciting the suttas out loud. So then the next circumstance, so this is the fourth one, the Buddha says, here a monk is not taught the Dhamma, does not teach the Dhamma, and does not recite the Dhamma, but he thinks about, mentally explores, and mentally examines the Dhamma that he has heard and mastered. Monks, when a monk thinks about, mentally explores, and mentally examines the Dhamma that he has heard and mastered, he experiences the meaning and the Dhamma. When one experiences the meaning and the Dhamma, joyfulness is born, euphoria, tranquility, happiness. When one is happy, one's mind enters samādhi. So this is the fourth circumstance of liberation. So this also is interesting because it's indicating the role of the thinking mind. So sometimes when people come to Buddhist practice, they think that Buddhist practice means having a silent mind all the time. This is not necessarily true. Your silent mind can still be filled with delusion. Your silent mind can still be filled with harmful impulses. And your silent mind can still be far from enlightenment. So just having a silent mind is not necessarily the path to awakening. It's useful at times. When you're practicing concentration meditation, a silent mind is pretty much a necessity. It's something which is indispensable. But there also is a place for active thinking, actively thinking about the Dhamma, consciously examining and pondering the teachings of the Buddha, really trying to get a deep sense of the implications of what the Buddha was talking about. So over the years, I've met a lot of people who they acquire quite a bit of theoretical knowledge about the Dhamma, but it never goes beyond that. It's just a bunch of words in their mind. They never take the time to really examine those words, to really try to comprehend the meaning of what the Buddha was talking about. One of the similes that the Buddha gives is that it's like a spoon in a pot of soup. Even though the spoon is completely immersed in the soup, it never tastes it. So this is what it's like. You can be immersed in the Dhamma, but if you never take the time to really deeply ponder and consider the Dhamma, then you will never taste it. So this is the preliminary to the arising of wisdom. So one of the formulations of this, which I like to refer to, is the three kinds of wisdom. So sutta maya panya is the wisdom that comes from information, from reading and listening. And then there's chintamaya panya, the wisdom that comes from thinking, which is what the Buddha is talking about here. Chintamaya panya is when we really think about and consider and contemplate the Dhamma that we've heard, trying to get to a deeper understanding, a more thorough and profound understanding. And then the third kind of panya is bhavanamaya panya, so the wisdom that comes from development, from cultivating wholesome mind states. So experiential wisdom. But the basis of that experiential wisdom is the wisdom that comes from thinking. And the basis of the wisdom of thinking is the wisdom that comes from knowledge, from information. So there's a clear progression there. So again, there is a place when one should ponder the Dhamma, think about the Dhamma, mentally consider the Dhamma. And again, starting from the possibility that we might be wrong, starting from the possibility that whatever understanding and concept we have of Dhamma already, it might be flawed or incomplete or distorted in some way. So we should always be willing to accept the possibility that we might have misunderstood something, that our current viewpoints might be incorrect. And we explore the Dhamma from that basis of acknowledging that our current viewpoints may not be accurate. This is what makes it possible to attain a deeper understanding. Then finally, the fifth circumstance, the Buddha says, here a monk is not taught the Dhamma and does not teach the Dhamma, and does not recite the Dhamma, and does not think about the Dhamma, but he has a particular samadhi object which he has held well, attended to well, taken up well, and penetrated well with wisdom. Monks, when a monk has a particular samadhi object that he has held well, attended to well, taken up well, and penetrated well with wisdom, he experiences the meaning and the Dhamma. Joyfulness is born, euphoria is born, one's body becomes tranquil, one experiences happiness. When one is happy, one's mind enters samadhi. So this is the fifth circumstance of liberation. So this finally is where we get to meditation practice. So in these 5 circumstances of liberation, again, noticing that the first 4 are not arising during meditation practice. The first 4 are hearing the Dhamma, teaching the Dhamma, reciting the Dhamma, and thinking about the Dhamma. Those are the first 4 circumstances under which one might attain enlightenment. The 5th one is when one has chosen a meditation object, a meditation method. The term that's used here is Samadhi Nimitta, so an object of samadhi, something that one is focusing one's mind on intently. And one holds one's mind on that samadhi object firmly and steadily. And he says one penetrates it well with wisdom. So in other words, this is not just some empty mind samadhi, but rather it's samadhi coupled with wisdom, which we would normally understand to mean coupled with the recognition of impermanence, the recognition of emptiness, the recognition of unsatisfactoriness, and the recognition of the impersonal nature of phenomena. So holding one's mind steady on one's samadhi object and recognizing that that samadhi object also is impermanent, impersonal, unsatisfying, empty of inherent existence. So in this way, one can come to a deep experiential understanding of the Dhamma, a direct realization of the impermanence and insubstantiality of all things. So this is the 5th circumstance of liberation. It's practicing samadhi conjoined with insight. So that's the end of this sutta. So a short, lovely sutta. At this time, if you have any questions or comments, please go ahead and enter them in, and I'll answer them as best I can. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Bhante, for sharing that sutta with us. And good morning to all the new friends joining in, as well as Vimukti, which is very fitting for today's sutta. There's probably a relationship there. Vimukti.
It's a Sanskrit form.
Great. And there's a couple of questions. So Gita and Yana says, Bhante, as one learns and studies the Dhamma and continues one's meditation, will one remove ignorance and awaken to the truth of samsara?
Hopefully. It's not a guarantee, though. So you have to make effort, a conscious, sincere effort to uproot one's own defilements and to relinquish attachment to self-identity. And that's not easy. But if you are sincere in your practice and you make an effort to constantly draw closer to the Dhamma and embody the Dhamma, to relinquish your defilements and to cultivate wisdom, then yeah, you will eventually attain enlightenment. It might be in this life. It might be in the next life. It might be in 100 lifetimes. It might be in 3 eons. But you will eventually attain enlightenment. So the most important thing in our practice is just to make sure that we're pointed in the right direction. And we'll get there eventually. Okay?
And Michael says, may we teach Dhamma that we have not yet had direct experience of? I've often thought that this is the prerequisite to teaching, but I'm beginning to see where this might not be so.
Yeah, it's not the case. So if you only taught what you have direct experience of, then, well, most Dhamma talks would be quite limited in scope and not very interesting, to be perfectly honest. And also, very few Dhamma talks then would ever talk about enlightenment. Because by definition, then only enlightened beings would be able to talk about enlightenment. So that would be pretty narrow in scope. So I've never been a fan of that idea. I've heard it before, but I don't see it as being of much use. I remember one time many years ago, I was staying at a monastery and a guest monk came, and he gave a really beautiful talk about karma and rebirth. And then afterwards, one of the lay residents started complaining, like, what is this? He's talking about something he doesn't personally know. He should just give a talk about what he knows. He should say things like, when I focus on my breathing, I get calm. And I'm sitting here thinking, okay, that's like the most boring Dhamma talk ever. Can you imagine if every time you went to a talk, the monk is like, when I focus on breathing, I get calm. Okay, that's it. Any questions? Useless. Of course, sometimes you do have to talk about things which you don't have direct personal knowledge of. If that makes you uncomfortable, then clarify that this is not something you have direct personal knowledge of. But maybe you can talk about why you're speaking about it. Maybe you can talk about its role within the Buddha Dhamma. Talk about why you have some confidence in it. And yeah, it's fine to clarify that you don't have direct personal experience of something. But you can also say that this is something which is a critical element of the Buddhist tradition, and therefore is not to be set aside lightly, and is to be something which we should attempt to understand. It is something which we should make a conscious effort to come to a deeper understanding of. Again, there's a good reason why these teachings have been held for 2,500 years without significant alteration. So we should make the humble effort to try to deeply understand the traditional teachings. And one of the ways that we understand them is by sharing our understanding with others. Okay? Also, sometimes when you share something with another person, then they reflect back their own understanding, which then deepens yours. I've also had that experience many times where I taught a particular Dhamma subject to someone, and then they're like, oh, so what you're saying is, and then they give some explanation of their own view, and I'm like, wow, that's amazing. I hadn't thought of it that way. What a wonderful perspective. That's really helpful. So teaching also is a way of beginning a conversation, which can be very mutually beneficial. Okay?
And Michael also says, going with the chanting flow sounds like dropping the self, giving up attachment.
Yeah.
And Denise Guzman says, how can we avoid the hindrance of doubt from taking over when we acknowledge the possibility of having misunderstood the Dharma?
So there's different kinds of doubt. This has gone into deeply in the Zen schools, by the way, because they talk about the doubt that leads to wisdom. as opposed to doubt which leads to inaction. So doubt which leads to inaction is like, I'm not really sure if the Buddha was enlightened. I'm not really sure if the Dhamma is real, so I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to go eat some Cheetos and watch TV for 6 hours. That would be the doubt that leads to further delusion, to inaction, to a lack of practice. But the doubt which leads to enlightenment is the doubt which is like, I'm not sure I understand the Dhamma, so I really need to make a sincere effort to understand. I'm not sure I have a profound realization, so I really need to make an effort to get the powerful samadhi necessary for true insight. I'm not really sure what the Buddha meant about these topics, so I'm going to study them thoroughly, and I'm going to have deep conversations with advanced practitioners, and I'm going to try to feel the truth of them for myself. That kind of doubt is actually good. And as far as questioning our own understanding, well, that's actually a good thing to do. What do we think the Dhamma is? What do we think is the truth of certain topics or aspects of Dhamma? And ask ourselves, is this accurate? And then seek to understand. If there's any doubt in the mind, then try to clear up that doubt. So not just wallowing in doubt, not just drowning ourselves in doubt, but trying to clear up the matter. Read the suttas. Read Dhamma books by good monastics. Discuss the Dhamma with advanced practitioners, with senior monastics. Really make an effort to understand. Then doubt will fall away naturally in its own time. And it will be replaced by a deep faith, a deep understanding. Okay?
And Kauser friend asks, is enlightenment possible through the study of the Dhamma without a meditation practice?
Not really. Not really. So the problem is that without a meditation practice, then our study tends to be superficial. It tends to just float on the surface of the mind, but it doesn't pierce deeply. A few years ago, I met someone who had gone through the Geshe training program, which is in Tibetan Buddhism, they have these ridiculously long and complicated training programs, which usually take at least 12 years, can take up to 20 years. And during that time, they deeply and intensively study in an academic context the Dhamma in excruciating detail. But they don't necessarily do any meditation. They learn about the existence of meditation and ways of meditating, but they don't necessarily practice any meditation. They're just studying the Dhamma intellectually. And the theory is that then after finishing the study program, then you're supposed to go off and meditate intensively and come to a deep understanding. But the reality is a lot of geshes don't meditate. And this one particular geshe did not meditate and was in fact very opposed to meditation practice. And so I was talking to him and we had some interesting conversations about Dhamma. But his defilements were completely obvious to everybody in the room. He was just like splattering his defilements everywhere, every time he opened his mouth. So it was really clear that just having that knowledge in his mind wasn't doing him that much good. That's probably better than nothing, probably a lot better. And again, he could talk about certain topics of Dhamma with incredible clarity. But it was superficial. It didn't go beneath the level of intellectual thought. So that's not so useful. Not so useful. So to answer your question, is it possible to attain enlightenment through study without meditation? Not really. No. No, because without training the mind in this deep, nonverbal, vision of the Dhamma, this deep nonverbal feeling of the Dhamma, it's very difficult to change the deep set subconscious patterns of mind, which are what generate our dukkha, which are what generate this delusional experience of samsara. Okay.
And that was the final question on YouTube, unless someone here has a question.
Jens, yeah.
Bhante, I was wondering about teaching, and as an example, obviously, let's say, for example, I meet a stranger or somebody in need. I'm not giving them explicit teachings of the Dhamma or the Buddha, but I might give an example of metta or compassion. Is that considered teaching, or where does that fall in? Just being a representative of the Dhamma and expressing the characteristics of the Dhamma as we interact in the world?
Yeah, that's fine. You don't necessarily need to be a monk to teach the Dhamma. You don't necessarily need to be a highly advanced practitioner. So you can share what you know, you can share what's helped you, and it's important to do so with a mind of humility, so acknowledging your own limitations. And it's also fine to evaluate the context. So who are you speaking to? What are the situations? What's relevant? So if you're speaking to somebody who's not Buddhist or not interested in Buddhism, then when speaking about Dhamma, it's good to avoid technical terms. It's good to avoid saying things that sound too specifically religious, but just talking in general terms about like, oh, yeah, when your mind is filled with desire, you're not very happy, are you? Pretty much anyone would agree with that. Or talking about the happiness that comes from compassion and generosity. These are things anyone can relate to. What's on your mind? Okay.
And Gita Jnana says, Bhante, is meditation extremely important in order to experience and see the Dhamma with noble wisdom?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, again, without a deep meditation practice, it's difficult to come to a deep realization of the Dhamma. But conversely, without intellectual understanding of the Dhamma, you can do hours of meditation every day for decades without coming to a deep realization either. So there must be both. There must be both study and practice. Otherwise, our practice without study tends to be just pretty much a waste of time, to be perfectly honest. The mind can be very peaceful, but it won't become wise. And conversely, study without meditation is just a bunch of papancha, a bunch of mental proliferation and complication. It doesn't necessarily bring one to a deep understanding. So we need to have both. We need to have both study and meditation if we want to really understand what the Buddha was talking about. There's also a lot of suttas where it's actually remarkable. Somebody who doesn't have a meditation practice, they'll read the sutta and they'll think it means one thing. But then somebody who has a deep meditation practice, they read the sutta and they have a completely different understanding. Because the Buddha, in many suttas, he's talking about meditation. But he's talking about meditation in a way which is not immediately recognizable to one who doesn't have a deep meditation practice. So one who comes at the Dhamma from a strictly scholastic or academic standpoint will tend to miss those things entirely. They either won't recognize the cues at all, or they'll think it means something other than it does. This is actually really clear if you look at the treatises and essays and translations and such of the early European scholars of Buddhism. So back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, a lot of Europeans and especially British people and Germans started studying Buddhism. And a lot of that early study was done purely from a scholastic and academic standpoint. And they came to the wildest misunderstandings, just mind-blowing, things which to us is just like, how could they possibly have thought that? And it's because, once again, they were approaching the Dhamma purely from an academic standpoint. And that's a disaster waiting to happen. One must have both intellectual study and also deep meditation practice in order to really understand what the Buddha was pointing to. Okay. Anything else?
And Unknown says, I just bought the Majjhima Nikaya and the Samyutta Nikaya, a must
Good.
for Dhamma practice.
Great. Yeah, read them cover to cover. Don't skip any sutta. Don't jump around. Read them cover to cover. You want to get every single one of them.
Okay. So it seems like that's all for this morning. So thanks everyone for joining us. You can come back this evening at 7:30 p.m. New York City time for some meditation as well as a Dhamma talk. And then tomorrow morning for a sutta study again, and then monk chat in the evening. So good to see everyone. We can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu.
And enjoy the rest of your day.